Does any other member seek recognition? Mr. Huffman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is disappointing to see House Republicans today pushing a package of bills that weaken our nation's response to the climate crisis, gut environmental regulations for oil and gas producers, and undermine the Endangered Species Act. That description could aptly apply to H.R. 1, but in this case, it also applies to H.J. Res. 29, which is a deceptively dangerous resolution involving the lesser prairie chicken. With this entire package of bills, Mr. Chairman, it just seems like Team Extreme has outdone itself. I know, Mr. Chairman, you have sometimes referred to yourself as a Teddy Roosevelt conservationist and pointed out that conservative has the root word conserve. Actually, the Oxford Dictionary defines conservationist as someone who advocates or acts for the protection and preservation of the environment and wildlife. And I would love to see evidence that conserve is still the root word of the modern conservatives in the Republican Party, but what we see instead is politics, and unfortunately legislation like this that elevates extreme politics over science-based wildlife management. It is extreme. Let's be very clear. It is very extreme to use the Congressional Review Act to prevent listing of a species. It's the equivalent of taking away federal Endangered Species Act protection and then burning the bridge to prevent that protection from ever kicking in should that species continue to crash. And that's why it's no exaggeration to say that this is tantamount to legislating extinction. And Mr. Chairman, you pointed to the Delta smelt in your opening remarks as an example of how the ESA doesn't work. I would suggest it's a perfect example of what happens when you have politics interfering with and overriding science-based wildlife management. We know that in the case of the Delta smelt, NOAA fish scientists came forward with what was needed in order to prevent this species from continuing its slide toward extinction and try to recover it, get it off the Endangered Species Act. And what happened? The Trump administration overrode them. Political appointees overrode them and came to the opposite conclusion, that you could continue taking away the water and impairing the habitat that the Delta smelt needed to recover. So sure, if you want to interfere every single time with science-based wildlife management, I guess you could point to the ESA as not working the way it's intended, but I would suggest that that shows what happens when you elevate politics over science-based wildlife management. That's what this package of bills does. When you have politicians calling the balls and strikes on species protection and habitat protection, you don't have an Endangered Species Act. You've just got politics. And what you're going to get is a continued slide towards extinction, not just for the lesser prairie chicken, but for a lot of other species. Now, Mr. Chairman, you talked about voluntary measures that we all celebrate when they happen. When they can restore habitat and protect species, and in the case of the lesser prairie chicken, there's been some good work on the ground in that regard. That happened because there is a backstop of listing under the Endangered Species Act. People don't step forward and do these things out of the goodness of their heart. They do it because they want to avoid the uncertainty and the legal problems and other things that tend to ensue when a species crashes and gets put on that endangered species list. And so when you take away that backstop and then burn the bridge by using the Congressional Review Act, you do the opposite of supporting voluntary conservation measures. You take away all incentive for those measures to happen in the first place. And we heard that quite candidly from a professor who was a witness in our last hearing on this subject. So, Mr. Chairman, I just couldn't disagree more with some of the statements that were made. I think those who want to believe that there are still Teddy Roosevelt conservationists in today's Republican Party will be gravely disappointed if they're tuning in on C-SPAN today. I urge all my colleagues to vote no on this extreme and dangerous resolution and the rest of this package, and I yield back.